Welcome to the 2025 Summer Heat Series on Demand, brought to you by the Industrial Athletic Trainers Society Continuing Education Program. Following the video, check the video description for more information about how members can collect their CEU for this video. Let's get started.
Alrighty, welcome everybody. We are here this week for the Industrial Athletic Training Society's Heat Hazard IQ awareness. So this is a 3-day event. Today we are getting started with the hot zone, worker awareness and acclimation. So really happy that Susan is kicking us off here. And then stick around at the very end to get access to the QR codes and the links to claim your CEU certificate. So to start, I wanted to introduce here, for those who are not aware, we have with us Susan Taw. She is our wonderful Industrial Athletic Training Society president. She also has graduated from Radford University with a bachelor's in athletic training and the University of Alabama at Birmingham with a master's in engineering and advanced safety engineering and management. With almost a decade of experience in the industrial athletic training space, Susan has worked with a variety of laborers, with delivery drivers to welders. Susan has been a trailblazer, pushing organizations to take from the best of athletic training practices with interventions like body weight tracking and acclimatization programming for manufacturing workers, and bringing the gold standard for heat stroke treatment to construction sites in South Texas. Susan has been educating fellow peers on heat and hydration programming since 2019 through advanced level continuing education, and we are so excited to have her. Thank you, Susan, and go ahead and take over.
All right. Thank you, Mike, for that phenomenal intro. That saves me the time of doing the intro that I have. So that's wonderful. But yes, hello and welcome, everyone. I'm super excited to talk to you guys about this topic that is near and dear to my heart. I think that we realize heat is fast becoming one of the leading areas of impact when it comes to occupational health and well-being. And definitely, as you know, our world continues to change, it's becoming something that we have to continue to focus on. So we have quite some ground to cover today, and I hope to maximize your time as best I can. So really, we're going to be looking at reviewing heat hazards and how we identify heat hazards, and then the heat illness risk factors that contribute to an increased risk of having a heat illness or injury. And then we're going to look at two key areas: dehydration and worker acclimatization. And then hopefully we can conclude with some general takeaways, and I can answer any questions that you may have. So Mike already did the honor of introducing me. Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate that. I have been lucky to spend my entire career in the industrial setting. Definitely my entire AT career has pretty much been industrial. And I've had a variety of roles, from your injury prevention role to being on the client side, focusing on administering our health and safety programs, to client growth and team building in the industrial AT and healthcare side of things. And I have been able to experience a plethora of industries along the way. And my education is unique in that I did have the opportunity to grow a little bit more in the engineering side of safety, focusing on injury prevention, especially regarding ergonomics and human factors. So, our key objectives today are going to be to understand how to accurately assess heat hazards and identify the presence of a heat hazard, to be able to classify external and internal risk factors and really understand how those can be controlled or why those matter, and then develop a tailored heat acclimatization program that addresses the unique risks, especially helping identify and make visible some of the internal risk factors that your workers may possess, and then be able to determine the status of a worker, especially when it comes to how acclimated they are to the environment that is going to be present where they work. I've kind of tried to chop this into sections. So if you have a burning question, hopefully it can kind of wait per section if it's ready to go there. If not, and you really have to chime in, I'm sure you can send it in the chat. Mike will probably be tracking that for me, or you can hold it to the end, whichever works best for you. So, heat. Heat is the deadliest weather phenomenon in the United States, according to the National Weather Service, and is positively correlated with all cause mortality, right? So, when we talk about that, what does this mean? This means that not only, of course, do you have the risk of heat related illnesses when you have heat present, like heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and so on, but heat also exacerbates any pre-existing condition that someone might have present and increases the likelihood that they succumb to um, things that are not explicitly heat in themselves. So this is kind of where we see heat being this tricky thing when it comes to determining how we go about preventing heat illness and how we identify the likelihood of heat illness taking place. And this is not a new problem, even with the challenges that we face as an industry regarding heat. I wanted to kind of bring you guys back to the Hoover Dam construction project, right? Where in the 1930s, these workers went on strike, and part of their demands the was for the heat um, conditions that they were facing to be addressed. So what they had going on here was that, man, in the summer, even in the shade, you were looking at 120 degrees Fahrenheit. But even in the sun, these temps would regularly soar to 140 degrees. And it was reported at this time that 14 workers died of what at the time was called heat frustration, with another two people in the local environment also passing away. So eventually, these workers went on strike, and it was kind of started off as a result of a wage cut at the time. But part of their request included things like cold water being made available and their living conditions. And even though this strike broke, the company did actually make improvements to their conditions, and a key part of that was making water available to these workers because, again, it was one of the largest concerns at that time. So, when we're talking about heat and determining whether we are looking at a heat hazard or not, right? One of the big questions is, where does this hazard begin? What do we consider to be a heat hazard? Or how hot is too hot? We consider a heat hazard generally to be an environmental condition that is going to increase the likelihood of heat illness or injury. And while we know that the likelihood of a heat illness or injury taking place depends on a variety of factors, we can, as a profession, understand that there are environmental conditions that are going to significantly increase that likelihood or make it more probable. All that being said, there is not an environmental condition where you can say someone will not have a heat illness or injury, right? Especially as athletic trainers, we understand the role that exertion plays in heat illnesses. And even in cool temperatures, you can have people who build up enough internal heat to where they can succumb to heat illness. And at the same time, you're rarely going to have, and I would even say you won't have environmental conditions where you can say a heat illness is going to be certain, right? You can have 500 workers in a field and only two of them die from heat stroke, but everybody is working. That being said, there are some identified areas where you can identify that further assessment and monitoring is needed. For the military, their awareness begins at a wet bulb of 75 degrees Fahrenheit, is where they start tracking. And then looking at some of our leading groups in our own industry, OSHA has their initial heat trigger at a heat index of 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So to them, that is where their first set of recommendations regarding heat illness and injury prevention typically begin. And then they have their high heat trigger set at a heat index of 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is where a second set of additional recommendations and even requirements are going to begin. Now, these numbers are attributed to NIOSH numbers, and I already see a typo on here, but NIOSH created the recommended alert limit, which coincides with the initial trigger limit, as where you're going to want to start, tracking, monitoring, and introduce controls for unacclimatized workers. That is where OSHA's heat index of 80 degrees is supposed to correlate with. So that's the NIOSH RAL there, not REL. Um, and the interesting thing about NIOSH's number and how they chose to go about it is, one, they use a wet bulb, which we appreciate, and two, they actually incorporate the metabolic heat production by these workers. So it's going to be 59.9 minus 14.1 to a log 10 by their watts, like their metabolic rate that they're working at. Same metabolic heat production is incorporated into the recommended exposure limit. And this is the heat stress exposure limit that NIOSH recommends for acclimatized workers. Okay, so that is supposed to coincide with what OSHA considers a high heat trigger. So if what you're looking for are number values to start incorporating into your heat illness prevention awareness, these are some really good numbers to consider, are scientifically validated by some of the leading industries. But a number is not just a number, and a lot of us know that. So I'm sure some of us are very familiar with this map, right? Corey Stringer has pushed it out quite a few times. Most of us probably saw this in our education and programs. Your state might use these parameters, especially for those of you at the secondary school settings or collegiate settings. But this map and what these scientists really wanted to incorporate here was that where you are located geographically has a marked difference on what your heat safety risk is going to look like. So that's where they created these regional heat safety thresholds. And you can see here that they have geographically divided the country up into three main categories. And notably, you can see that where category one, the wet bulb that has them tapping out at the for the day, right, 86, is still just the use discretion range for people who live in the category three region. And again, we understand that that's because heat tolerance is going to look different for individuals who've spent a long amount of time in these areas. There are also a couple of other options that I wanted to introduce you guys to. Again, the goal just being, when you are looking and considering heat safety in your area, how many tools can you use at your discretion to be able to make an educated guess for what you can expect in the summer months, or what you can expect when it comes to your local heat hazard. So you have the Köppen climate classification. This is a classification that it divides climates into five general groups, which are tropical, arid, temperate, continental, and polar. And then what they've actually also done is they've added a second letter classification and then a third letter classification in some of these groups. So typically what you're going to see is this second letter classification is discussing precipitation and wetness. So that's going to give you a clue kind of into what your humidity expectations can be. And then that third letter classification is going to identify what you can expect when it comes to the heat. So I'm based out of San Antonio, and we are a bordering group. And we are humid subtropical, bordering hot semi arid. Okay, so again, that is going to just kind of give us a general idea of what we can expect when we start looking into what our climate expectations are, especially for those of us with outdoor workers, and what kind of weather we can expect, including, of course, historical forecasting and things like that. And then there's kind of a third tool that if you need something additional in your pocket, you do have the USDA hardiness zone. So for those of you who have green thumbs or gardeners, you may already be familiar with this. But basically what this does is it divides North America, or at least the US and Canada, up into these numbered zones. And what they are looking at here is actually going to be your lowest average temperature in the winter, obviously, typically to say what plants are going to succeed or not. This has kind of two benefits here. One being that it may help with estimating acclimatization for your workers, kind of leads into those heat regions that we looked at before. But the other benefit is if your heat illness prevention program is built into your temperature extreme program, meaning that you look at both temperature extremes, then this could be helpful for cold weather illness prevention, because this is going to tell you how cold it actually gets there. So this is definitely something worth documenting if your program includes both of those sides of the coin. Here in San Antonio, we are 8B to 9A. So the coldest we're going to get down to typically is about 20 degrees, really mid 20s. So we have very little to worry about when it comes to that. But again, it's helpful for kind of informing these programs as you build them. So that at least gets us to where we're looking at local conditions, local climate. We have a solid picture of where we are, but obviously we understand maybe not all of our workers are utilities or construction, agriculture, and some of these more outdoor areas. And that means that we may have to do some immediate monitoring. If we're not just looking at general climate and what we can expect, there is the expectation that these workers are having their heat conditions monitored, especially where you would expect there to be hazardous heat present. There are going to be two main ways to do this. You can use local weather forecasting actively, day to day forecasts, or you can choose to make these measurements yourself. This is going to be very helpful for our indoor people, where you have things like steam or maybe processes in a facility that are contributing to your potential heat hazard. The military requires their wet bulb to be measured every hour as part of their monitoring process. OSHA, I'm not aware that they have a prescription. So it may be up to you to kind of document and determine how often you are monitoring these areas. Some places may have continuous monitoring, but how often you're monitoring these areas to ensure that you clearly understand the hazard that's present. So when it comes to local weather forecasts, you have a few options. The National Weather Service or any other reputable source like Weather Century, WeatherBug, and some of those are going to give you your good generic forecasts. How many of us are familiar with the Ocean NIOSH heat safety tool? Probably a good amount of us. That is also very popular for managing local heat conditions and getting a good understanding of your local heat conditions. I'm going to highly, highly recommend if you are not familiar with the AIHA heat app that they created. That's the American Industrial Hygienists Association. They have made a phenomenal product. And I'm going to show you guys really quickly here what this looks like, because this is bar none my favorite heat local monitoring tool that exists on the market today. So hopefully after seeing this, you will delete the OSHA NIOSH app and never look back. I have sent them so much commentary about that app, and was hoping that they would really make some fixes there. But now this app exists, so it doesn't matter anymore to me. Okay, so in the AIHA heat stress app, what you are going to see is one, they estimate wet bulb, which is fantastic. And then similar to your NIOSH and OSHA app, they are going to kind of estimate whether you're in the extreme, or whatever category of risk level they're assigning to that. But a couple of other notable things that happen here. They're going to give you your wet bulb. They're going to give you your temperature, your heat index, your humidity. They're going to have air quality in there for you. And what they're going to show you, which we'll look at in the next slide, is what your current work configuration is. And if it's been a while since you've updated this work configuration, it'll have that kind of alert you kind of see there that says, hey, it's important to make sure you update what are the current work conditions. And this is where you're actually able to input the work that you are assessing, and it will adjust the risk level category to match the type of work that you say is happening, which is incredible. So, a couple other things that they're going to do is they do give you recommendations. So, based on whatever your heat stress risk level is that it's assigned, it'll say, hey, these are currently our following recommendations. So in the screenshots in front of you, we're looking at a wet bulb of 86, and they're classifying that as extreme, especially with the work that's going on. And they are saying make sure your workers are acclimated. They're recommending a rest ratio of 40 to 45 minutes for every hour of work for those who are working in direct sunlight. They're recommending 32 to 48 ounces of water per hour, and they're recommending electrolyte replacements, and avoiding strenuous activity and so on based off of the current risk level. So it really gives curated recommendations, which is great, and this can be really handy for those of you who may have safety staff or work crews that are more dispersed, and they kind of just need to be able to have guidance on making an educated decision for what um, their work is going to be. Notably, in here, they do say those recommendations are understandably restrictive, but again, it's based on their assessment of an extreme risk level being present. So, the part that I was talking about with putting in your working conditions, they're actually going to let you input information. So they ask you about the workload. What is the work that is happening? And you can tell it. So in the version that you just saw, the workload was selected as moderate. And they give you examples of what they consider moderate work to be. They consider that's sustained moderate hand and arm work, or arm and leg work, arm and trunk work, light pushing and pulling, normal walking. And they give some suggestions like transplanting, picking vegetables or fruits, or pesticide application. Um, they have examples of light work, which include things like operating machinery or labeling things. And then they have heavy work, like digging soil. And then they have very heavy work, like heavy shoveling or heavy digging. And so you can then select the kind of met rate, right, that you're contributing to this assessment. You can put in the clothing that is being worn. Are they wearing light coveralls? Are they wearing double layer clothing? Are they wearing vapor barrier clothing? And so on. You can put in what is your radiating heat looking like? Okay, so do you have things like a running furnace or maybe a piece of machinery that's off putting steam or things like that? And then you're going to put in what's your cloud coverage look like? Is it a cloudy day, a sunny day, and so on? So if you do not have this app or you're not familiar with it and you think that this is something that may be valuable to you, I highly, highly recommend it. They've really done a phenomenal job on this app, and it's one of my favorite tools. But then let's also remember these are local conditions, right? And they'll tell you on there what is the location of the weather meter they're using. But this is just telling you what the nearest airport is or whatever the closest weather station is. It's not giving you a clear look at the conditions where you are located. And to do that, you're going to need some kind of gauge or tool to identify on site measurements. This can typically be a temperature or humidity gauge. Here I have a digital one that you can use. And then I also have a dial clock, a kind of dial version that you might see some of these hanging up in your facilities. And then we also have the ever wonderful wet bulb heat stress tracker, meter, or whatever you can use. At most of my sites, we use a Kestrel. There are other versions on the market that you can use. Whatever falls in you guys' budget that you're able to acquire. We understand, especially when we're working in the sun, that a wet bulb is going to be your gold standard. And this is well established across industries, whether it's industrial, military, athletics, and so on. Okay. So when we're assessing our local conditions, what are we going to be looking for here? You definitely want to prioritize high risk areas that may not be well represented by your local forecast. People working near hot machinery, unventilated areas, confined spaces, things like that. Workers in direct sunlight. Again, we've had construction projects where we had some workers working on a wall that is, white rock and it's just radiating this heat at them. And then workers working 800 feet away in a grassy area with wind and shade. Those conditions are going to be completely different. And that's where the benefit of on site measurements comes in, not just relying on the local forecast, but being able to say, this is, these are the conditions that our workers are currently in, and we can ensure that we are using the necessary controls that we should have available based on those conditions. Um, Check out tomorrow's talk if you want to learn more about those controls. We're going to be skipping all that today, but that's at least a little bit of an overview about how we assess our heat presence and know what hazards are present, know what the conditions are, and make sure that we're eyes wide open when it comes to kind of being aware of the circumstances that work is taking place in. So now we're going to jump a little bit into our heat illness risk factors and kind of start to talk about what that looks like for us. Okay. So let's get into our heat illness risk factors. First, a quick definition. Simply put, these are going to be the factors that contribute to the probability or likelihood of a heat related illness or injury. We know that these are split into two groups, external and internal factors. Generally, your external factors are going to be factors that come from the environment that are typically not individual based, but they're environmentally based or due to the work that is happening. And then your internal factors are going to be your individual factors. So these are based on the per person. And we have to put a lot of work into being able to identify and root these out, especially for our ATs in the group, or those of us who are the ones delivering injury prevention programming and care on our projects. So, quick overview of external factors. These are typically going to be some of the things we just discussed monitoring, like temperature, humidity, radiant heat sources, ventilation, our met rate or the physical workload that is happening, clothing and personal protective equipment, and then our work schedule, right? How often do these guys work? How often do they get days off or taking a break? People working 7/12s are gonna, that presents a different likelihood of heat illness than people who are working 5/8s, right? So hopefully we understand that. So these are things that hopefully those of us who are here in the safety crowd are really considering how we can modify these external factors and reduce the probability or likelihood of a heat illness or injury taking place, because these are going to be things that are in the hand of ops and in the hands of safety. Then we have our internal factors. And for those of us who are on the clinical and injury prevention side, this is where a lot of our time is spent, right? Um, we're looking at acclimatization status. We know that our unacclimatized workers are going to be at our highest risk when it comes to the likelihood of a heat illness. Hydration status. Dehydration is going to significantly impair the body's cooling mechanisms. Those are going to be the two areas we're really going to talk about today, because these are areas where we can make an active difference. Pre-existing medical conditions, heart disease, diabetes, kidney disease, and even things like minor illness. So you see the military will have a big focus often on, things like having a sore throat or a fever or nausea, or you had cold symptoms. And then also things like skin conditions, sunburn, heat rash, things like that. Those are internal factors that should be considered. A history of heat illness and injury. So we know past medical history of a heat stroke is going to be a significant internal factor. The military also considers having had heat exhaustion twice as a history of heat illness injury that they consider a significant internal factor. People taking medications, these are going to be typically your diuretics, antihistamines, some of your antidepressants, some of your stimulants, and so on. We know that that's going to affect the body's ability to thermoregulate, and therefore making it a potential exacerbating factor. Age, both you're very young and you're very old, are going to be more susceptible. And then fitness level and body mass. These are things that can increase strain when it comes to heat in the body. Alcohol and drug consumption also is going to be a significant risk factor. Ideally, these should be just obviously anyone with active alcohol or drug use at work that should be identified and they should be removed. But also, even looking at past use. So we know we have 4th of July coming up. Even the military tracks alcohol consumption within the last 24 hours as an internal factor. So looking at these workers and people when they're coming back to work, when they're coming back to work after the weekend, after a holiday, many of them are going to bring this internal risk factor with them. And another thing, more looked at by the military is going to be actually quality of sleep as a precursor, especially cumulatively over a couple of days. Have they been able to get adequate rest? So those are just going to be a few of the internal risk factors that on the injury prevention end are going to be important for us to kind of identify when it comes to individualizing our heat illness and injury prevention. But like I said, we're going to take a deep dive into hydration status and how dehydration affects our workforce. And then we're going to look at acclimatization and why that is extremely important. Any quick questions before we jump? Awesome. I'll take that as a no. Okay, so Dehydration. Dehydration is a very simple equation, okay? So we are looking at how much fluid you are taking in and how much fluid you are losing. And when we say fluid you're taking in, right, this is not just drinking glasses of water, it's not just um, electrolytes and Gatorade. You do consume fluid in fruits, in vegetables, and the foods that we eat. Same with fluid loss. This is not just um, sweating and urinating fluid away, but think about things like vomiting and how that can affect your hydration status. And even the fluid that you let out when you're talking, right? That is evaporating from you. So that is what goes into figuring out the dehydration equation and being able to understand what somebody's hydration status is. So when we talk about hydration, there are a couple of terms that are useful to know. Euhydration being your optimal level of hydration. Okay. This means that you don't have too much fluid, you don't have too little, you're just right. When we look at dehydration and losing water, we have a few options here. So you have your hypertonic dehydration. This is where you are losing more water than you are sodium. So typically think sweating. Okay. And then you have hypotonic dehydration where your sodium loss may exceed your water loss. And this can be even caused by things like your people taking diuretics. And then isotonic dehydration is where your sodium and water loss are proportionate to each other. And this can happen through processes like vomiting or diarrhea and so on, where you're just losing equal amounts of both. And that's going to be important to us, especially when we're looking at osmolality, right? Which is looking at our blood osmolality or urine osmolality as a hydration marker. This is where when you get people who need things like sweat testing or very particular forms of testing done, you're often trying to understand, how much sodium they're losing when they're sweating and making sure that you can balance that and get them to optimal euhydration. So I wanted to take a moment and just generally talk about the physiology of dehydration a little bit. This is not going to be very in depth. This is just a general overview because one thing that we find with dehydration is dehydration can cause morbidity and mortality all on its own. This is even without the exacerbating added factor of heat, and this is even without the other medical conditions that dehydration can complicate, but you can die from dehydration. So we found that dehydration kind of creates almost a cascade when it comes to its effect on the body because your body is going to prioritize you being adequately hydrated. And so there are processes that your body's going to go through when it notices that you are losing fluid. Main thing being that when you stimulate that thirst center in the brain, your body starts doing things to maintain your current level of hydration. And this work is typically going to be done through the kidneys, where you are essentially releasing you have renin that is released, which is going to trigger a host of other hormones, angiotensin being one of the more common ones. What that's going to do is constrict those arteries, right, so that it can kind of pump that blood pressure up and make do with the remaining blood volume that you have. At the same time, your kidneys are going into overdrive to reuptake kind of some of the fluids that are in your body and preserve the sodium and water that you have so that it can maintain your current blood volume. And this is part of why you'll see with people who are chronically dehydrated that they tend to run into a lot of chronic conditions, and that these chronic conditions can often be complicated by being dehydrated, because it is a whole body effort when you are dehydrated or when you are low on fluids. And it's unfortunate because it can have such disastrous effects, but it is very easily treatable and it's very easily preventable by ensuring that you are getting enough fluids and that you are getting enough sodium and electrolytes throughout the day to help your body maintain that hydration. So, in the acute sense, when you are looking at acute dehydration, what you are typically going to see as you lose fluid, liquid body weight, right? This is loss of fluids. You're going to see an increase in cardiovascular strain. This is because your heart rate is rising. Your body is vasoconstricting to get your blood pressure, keep your blood pressure up where it needs to be. With that, you're going to notice an increase in core body temperature, which that by itself is increasing our risk of developing an exertional heat illness, right? Especially if you're already doing rigorous active work. And then you're going to notice a decrease in aerobic power and muscular strength. So these individuals are going to notice that their work capacity is going down. And then you're going to start to have a decrease in motivation for these people, especially when it comes to how they are perceiving the level of exertion that they're putting out and what they're getting in return for that. You kind of notice this frustration that starts to come out with acute dehydration in your work groups. And then as you get into severe dehydration, you're really going to notice mental function get impaired. But chronic dehydration is also a huge, huge issue. And they found that even things like UTIs are associated with low fluid intake and low urine output. Chronic kidney disease is very highly associated with um, fluid consumption, and your heat illness is also considered a risk factor for chronic kidney disease. Even with your gastrointestinal functional constipation increases with fluid restrictions, you'll notice that you can actually improve functional constipation with by hydrating these patients. And then metabolic disorders like diabetes mellitus has an inverse relationship with increased water intake when it comes to type 2 diabetes. And also, there's a link between dehydration and poor outcomes with diabetic ketoacidosis. Circulatory, you can have a whole host of issues there, especially when it comes to hypertension. We know orthostatic hypotension is strongly related with dehydration. Normal brain function. Of course, our brain is highly dependent on being well hydrated, being adequately hydrated, and even brain morphology is linked to dehydration. And acute dehydration is directly linked to changes in the size of your brain ventricles and so on. So, hydration is extremely critical, not just to the active state of your workers, but also really looking at long term health of your workers. It really is something that I know it seems like we beat it to death, especially in these hotter months, but your life and your long term health are greatly affected by the ability to maintain hydration and stay adequately hydrated. So that's my quick overview of dehydration. We're going to talk about probably potentially why most of you are here, which is going to be worker acclimatization. This is one of the most impactful heat illness and injury prevention techniques, and unfortunately, one of the lesser prioritized ones. I've found in my experience that a lot of companies feel like they do not have the time to dedicate or the resources to dedicate to worker acclimatization. But the benefits of worker acclimatization are not new, okay? So, whenever I really am introducing the concept of worker acclimatization, especially to a new administration or a new company or team, safety team. I equate having an unacclimatized worker working in the heat as kind of the experience you feel when you are floating in a pool, right? I'm hoping most people here have swam or been in water. When you are floating in a pool, would you consider that the same as laying on a couch? And I can't even see everyone to see them shake their head or nod their head, but I'm assuming that most of us are saying, no, I would not consider that the same. Yes, no. And why is that, right? You're laying against something that is at least giving you some level of market resistance, but for some reason, you'll notice your heart is beating, you can fatigue and tire, your body is doing work. It is not the same as being sedentary, even if it looks sedentary, right? And this is something that I find is a great example of being unacclimated and working in the heat is like. Your heart is doing more work, your core is doing more work, you have more cardiovascular output happening, you are unsettled because you are doing the same task, but you are doing it in an environment that is notably different. And the effect on your body is going to be notably different in what your body has to do to have that same similar output that on the surface looks very similar. And acclimatization is not new. This is something that has been studied for probably soon to be nearing 100 years. So one of my favorite examples of acclimatization studies is, or would be, the mind studies that were done by Cyril Wyndham. He was performing some studies in mines in South Africa and Australia. And in one, he was looking at these workers in Australia where they were shoveling rock in these mines. And in one of his studies, he has these workers, I think it was about 110 workers he had in this study, shoveling rock for 6 days in the cooler part of the mine. This is about 86 degrees Fahrenheit, was what they called the saturated air temperature. So that's 100% humidity. They were shoveling rock for 6 days in that part, which was the cooler area, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. After 6 days of that, they moved them to the hotter area of the mine and had them shoveling rock for another 6 days. And this hotter area was about 91 and a half to 92 degrees Fahrenheit. And they would take the rectal temps at the start of the shift, 9 a.m., 11 a.m., and 1 p.m. Very good for their safety, right? To make sure that nobody's actually having a problem. So what they found was that in the cooler area on day one, the average rectal temperature was 101 degrees. And on day six, the average rectal temperature was 100.2. And then when they moved them to the hotter area, it went up slightly, but it did not go above what their rectal temperature was when they had first started this work, when they first started acclimating. It went up to about 100.2.8 on the first day, and by day six, their average rectal temperature was 100 degrees Fahrenheit flat. What they also found was that mean output from this group was higher on the first day when they were in the hot area than it was when they were in the cool area. And he also compared this to a group of workers, I think it was like 16 or 12 of them, that they'd actually had start directly in the hot area with no acclimatization at all. And those workers on day one had an average rectal temp of 101.8. So they considered this successful acclimatization, and I would too. Okay, so what is acclimatization? This is going to be a process of physiologically adapting to tolerate and environment. Now, you may hear the words acclimatization and acclimation. Big difference there is going to be that when you're acclimatizing someone, you are doing this in the natural environment that they're going to be working in, where acclimation can happen in a lab environment or a more severely controlled environment where you're actually better determining what they're going to be exposed to. But both of them are going to be a physiological adaptation that happens in the body. Okay. Acclimatization is just more in that natural environment, a little bit less predictable. Now, the benefits of acclimatization are many, main ones being that your heart rate and your cardiovascular system really stabilizes out. So you're going to have a decreased heart rate. Your body temperature is going to fluctuate a lot less. You are going to notice that you have less of your sodium coming out in your sweat. Your body is doing a better job with the efficiency of your sweating and retaining that sodium. And you feel like you're working less, which is always a perk. And then you're going to notice increases in your sweat rate. You're also going to start sweating earlier. Again, that's part of how your body maintains that temperature readily steady instead of it fluctuating up and down. And then you're going to notice increased blood flow, especially to the periphery, to the surface of the skin, and you're going to notice an increased performance. So, really, worker acclimatization is one of the most life saving components that we can have in our heat illness and injury prevention plan. And we are often going to find ourselves, we being the people here present, as the ones who are kind of steering, designing, and developing these programs and probably advocating them. So I'm going to spend probably the next 15 minutes just kind of going over some suggestions for how you can be successful in this endeavor and how you can kind of build a program that works for you wherever you are. Okay. So, first things first, we're going to do is we're going to determine what is going to be the scope of our program. This all starts with a very thorough hazard and risk analysis of the work that is taking place. You're going to want to look at all of your work areas. You're going to want to look at all your job tasks and job classifications. And you're really going to want to assess what are the temperatures there, how long is the work being done, what is the metabolic rate of this work, and what types of workers are typically doing these jobs, and are they at a higher risk than other workers who might be doing, more senior, more cushier jobs. And then you're going to want to also look while you're at it at the hydration practices that are in place, because I've often found that you can solve a lot of problems by addressing those if you notice that they're not sufficient. And another reason that is really important is that you cannot acclimatize your way out of dehydration. The good thing about acclimatization is that your body is able to be more efficient, but none of that matters if you're dehydrated. That will wipe away all of the benefits of being an acclimated worker. So that's really just something that you want to take the opportunity to analyze while you're assessing the work. So then you're going to kind of identify where your heat hazard areas are. And you're again particularly going to be looking at the conditions and the type of work, kind of the external factors that are going to be your higher risk. And then you're going to look at where your higher internal factors are going to be. So this is typically going to be maybe your new workers to site who are unacclimated, older workers, right? So let's say you work utilities or you work like in a really hot facility, like a boiler room or like a steam plant or something. Maybe your maintenance crew is all your most senior, most veteran workers there. You might consider those high risk workers and identify a way that you can ensure that they become acclimated when the heat rolls around. So, for the example that I'm going to be referring to for most of the rest of this talk, we're going to be looking at new hires in the hottest department at the facility I was at. And so this was a manufacturing facility, and We particularly looked at our curing department because in the summer months, ambient temperatures of around 107 to 109, but really in these at these cure presses, which is where most of these workers found themselves working, you were looking at about 130 to 140 degrees in front of those presses because those presses ran at about 300 to 350 degrees, right? Um, so that was kind of how we identified the area. And then, particularly in that area, we chose new hires as our high risk workers that we were going to be putting through acclimatization. So, once you've done that, you're then going to want to figure out, okay, we know what area we're in, we know who is going to be impacted. How are we onboarding these individuals? My recommendation, especially if you are here on the injury prevention side of things, okay, so organizational safety, is that you are not the first person to bring up the acclimatization program to the workers who are in the acclimatization program. Ideally, you are able to develop the program in a way that they are aware of the acclimatization process when they are being onboarded. So this can be brought up to them by their HR. One of the things we did was we actually had a pamphlet that they would get that explained the acclimatization process, or it's brought up to them by operations or even safety during their new hire orientation and training. So our new hires typically went through like a several day or a week long training and orientation. So not only did they get documentation for those who were in the curing department explaining the acclimatization program. During that training, safety also pulled them and said, hey, we need to do your onboarding for the acclimatization program. And that's when we came in, we got their initial weight, we got their blood pressure, we took some vitals, and we had them fill out a health history. So that's kind of step two. You want to collect health history and biometrics on these individuals. One, you're going to capture a lot of your internal risk factors, ideally with the prior medical history that you get. That's where you can ask about current medical conditions, medications that they're taking, history of heat illness, and some of those things we discussed earlier. And then you're going to want to collect their blood pressure and heart rate and their weight and height and other things that are going to be helpful either to identify potentially that they might already have, something like hypertension or something that could be concerning, or diabetes that they need to get further assessed. And so that you know these individuals' normals. Let's also remember this is your high risk group, which means it's much more likely that these workers are going to have a heat illness event. It's very normal. It's very helpful to know what that person's normal blood pressure is like, right, in that event. And then you're going to do some education. So you're going to go ahead and educate them on heat hazards. You're going to educate them on what the program is going to look like. So I'm throwing up a couple of our education examples here for you. And we had several flyers and posters and things that would go out around the plant during the summer. But really, you want to ensure that these workers in particular get this education. They know how dehydration affects their body. They understand what the main heat illnesses are that they might run into. They understand what exertional hyponatremia is and how it can be a hazard, but understanding that drinking ample fluid is important. They can understand the continuum of heat illness symptoms. And they understand how to adequately hydrate themselves, right? So this is education that you really want to ensure this group has, especially for us, knowing these were new hires. We really put together a lot of education for them. And while they were going through the acclimatization program, we would review aspects of this education with them to make sure they do understand what they need to maintain hydration, or what early symptoms of heat illness look like, and so on. Okay, so once you've succeeded and you've got your onboarding out of the way, they're in and they're started, you should have a clearly defined protocol of what the requirements are of the heat acclimatization program, knowing how they start, how long they're in this program. OSHA recommends 5 to 7 days. The NATA recommends 7 to 14 days. The military says 10 to 14 days. I would definitely recommend that your acclimatization program run 2 weeks, but also don't worry if it takes some people longer than 2 weeks. I've really learned in my time working with Gen Pop, these kind of workers, there's there are people who take a lot longer to level out. I've seen workers take up to 5 weeks. So have a way to continue to manage them effectively if they're not um, normal in 2 weeks. And then you're going to want to know, so you have your timeline and your schedule. You're going to want to know what that work exposure looks like, right? Some recommend you start them at 20% and you increase by 10 to 20% each day. Some say start them at 50% and increase by 10% each day. For our heat acclimatization program, they just worked a new higher work exposure level the whole time they were there. This meant they were learning their tasks, they were doing their full job, but they would get more breaks. They were covering fewer presses than someone who would be considered completely trained. So we didn't really have to manage adding on work. They just worked that kind of limited level the entire time that they were in the program. And then you're going to want to know what your monitoring and supervision looks like. Who is responsible for checking in with these workers? How are we checking in with them? And this is where you can really pull in operations and safety and the support. Operations, their local foremen or crew leaders and so on should be able to have eyes on these guys and understand and know that they're part of a program. So one thing that we do in construction a lot is we label the hard hats for people who are new to site, and it'll be like a really obnoxious color, and it'll either say like first 30 days, or sometimes you'll run a piece of tape around the brim of their hard hat and they have to keep that on for their first 30 days. Makes it a lot easier to give these guys a higher level of monitoring and supervision than you would the regular workforce. And then you're going to want to determine what are the metrics that you are taking, what data are you analyzing, what are you tracking. Okay, so for us, we were tracking body weight. We used short-term body weight loss and body weight gain as our measurement of hydration status. This is probably not foreign to any of you if you're athletic trainers on this call. This is very commonly used, especially with our summer athletes. So this is a bit of an example. We would have kind of these daily check-ins. Um, Everyone was on for a minimum of 7 days. Now, don't let that confuse you. 7 days was 2 weeks of work at this facility, okay? But you can see that we had the ability for someone to need to be on there 4 weeks, and we had people go even longer than that. So what they were instructed to do, we have their weigh in time. That's what they came to work as. Then we would have their way out time. Their goal was to stay within less than 10%, less than 10% would be a lot, less than 3% of their body weight. And then what we actually also looked at was the next day when they would weigh in, their goal was to be within 2% of the previous day's body weight. So even if you weigh out at 3% of your body weight, you're supposed to recoup some of that lost weight while you're home. So again, this process left room for the fact that the job is rigorous and a lot of guys just lost weight in general, but also helped us keep an eye on losing a lot of fluids, which would be kind of some of those more extreme numbers. So if you were within 1% of your body weight, you got a green. If you were within 2%, you got a yellow, I want to say. It was like 1 to 2 was something like that. And if you were over 3%, you were red. Okay. And to graduate, your average over your 2 weeks had to fall within the green category. If you were yellow, you had to stay on an additional week. And if you were red, those individuals either had to fall into the green category the next week or they stayed on an additional week after that. And so that was how we went ahead and monitored these workers. Now, of course, we know some people need additional assistance. And this is where having the means to individualize your program is very important. You should be able to extend this timeline the way that you need to. If someone is not acclimated, don't graduate them. There really is no point because odds are they're going to end up having a heat illness or injury because their body is showing that it's struggling in this environment and it's struggling with the load of work that they're being given. So, really working with operations and safety and finding ways to keep those individuals in the program but keep them at work is critical. We had one worker who lost over 20 pounds in 3 days, right? So, that is an individual that was not feeling very well. And we were working really hard to keep him hydrated, to help him eat right, to help him take in the right electrolytes and so on. And it still wasn't really working for him. And so we ended up giving him additional heat breaks. We ended up changing up the work he was doing a little bit to ensure that he wasn't being put at risk. And he ended up on the program for 5 weeks, but he still eventually graduated. His body acclimated to it. He got used to it. And when I ran into him a couple months later, he loved the job. It was a job that when he was in the program, he was seriously considering whether he would be able to do this job. And when I saw him a couple months later, he was like, I love this job. This job is awesome. I know my first month was really hard, but thanks so much for helping me with that. I'm really glad that I didn't quit and I stayed on. And he was a phenomenal employee. So sometimes these people need time and your program should create an opportunity for them to take the time that they need. And then same with that work exposure. Like I said, we had to modify some of his work a little. That was very rare that we would need that, but in this case we did. You're monitoring. Daily check-ins work for most people. If you notice that's not enough, you have to increase that frequency because not only are we ensuring that these people are, becoming acclimatized to the work they're doing, we're also trying to ensure that they do not succumb to a heat illness or injury during this process. So some people need more attention. And then you might find that some of these people need more analysis done to help them. These can be things like getting sweat testing done for these individuals, hydration testing, heart rate analysis, seeing where they're at. I highly recommend that if you work with an extremely high risk group where you commonly see issues around dehydration, um, around sweat loss and so on, that if you can, see if your organization can invest in solutions to perform a higher level of analysis on these workers. These can be things like using the sweatbands and sweat tools to be able to get actual process results on these workers and how they lose sweat and what their sweat makeup is. Wearing heart rate monitors for workers to be able to see where they're getting too high and help them better understand their work rest ratios and how to take breaks. You can even do your urine osmolality to look at dehydration, or even some of the newer hydration tools they have on the market that use saliva to determine their hydration status. So these are just things that you can use to augment your acclimatization program and really ensure that you are giving these workers as much information as you can to help them get where they need to be. And all the while, do recall our workers in the acclimatization program are the highest risk workers typically. So you really want to be prepared to manage and identify acute pathologies when they show up. These include things like heat edema. This is one, especially when people are acclimatized or getting acclimatized, you'll see, especially the guys who get the swollen hands. If they're saying like, yeah, my hands are getting really swollen and tight, odds are that's peripheral heat edema, and that is going to improve as they get more acclimatized to the environment. Heat rash, heat syncope, which is typically going to be self-limiting. So besides any kind of injury from a fall, if they sustain one, these are self-limiting conditions that improve again as their body gets better at managing their blood volume and fluid. Heat cramps, heat stroke, hyponatremia, and so on. You really want these workers educated at understanding when they're experiencing those symptoms, and we have to be prepared to manage those acute illnesses because these are the most likely workers to sustain any of these injuries or illnesses. Okay. And then when you are graduating or concluding your program, here are the things that you're going to want to look for. Ideally, this person demonstrates a knowledge of heat hazards and they know how to self assess and address the key components of avoiding a heat injury. So for most of these guys, it's going to be adjusting their hydration and recognizing when it's not enough or too much, and adjusting their work rate and recognizing when it's too much. And again, like I said, if you have the ability to get more monitoring tools to let these guys wear them or see exactly what's going on with them, that's how we can educate these guys to be able to better self-assess and become ready to graduate. They should be able to complete their full job task requirements. This is especially if you adjust their work requirements while they're on the heat acclimatization program. Your heat acclimatization program needs to end with them doing all of their job tasks. If you have someone where you're not able to get them fully to work and you had decreased their work because they were struggling, you don't want to graduate that individual until they can prove that they can do all the job task requirements and still not have any red flags. Speaking of, you want to make sure they don't have any physiological red flags. So, your rapid body weight fluctuations, you want to see that they're able to stay within the range that's been prescribed. Um, Especially for people who you are aware were having heart rate issues, you want to ensure that that resolves. Um, Same with the extreme exhaustion or work output. And again, that gets you to your can you do the job tasks? You don't just want to decrease those job tasks and graduate them from the program without ensuring that they can reach normal output safely and healthily. And acute heat illness. If somebody had, so in our program, if you had an acute heat illness while you were in the acclimatization program, that automatically extended you another 2 weeks. Okay. And then you want to make sure they completed all your program requirements, whatever those are that you introduce into your program. So this is typically what graduating from the program is going to look like. And with all things that we do in our universe, you want to be able to have a process for PDCAing this. Okay, that's our Plan, Do, Check, Act. You want to have a process where you're reviewing one, are we in compliance? So, one of the things that we saw and ran into were people not weighing in and weighing out like they were supposed to. But also, is this program working the way we wanted it to, or do we have adjustments that we want to make? Then you can kind of propose adjustments, especially discussing with your stakeholders and seeing what things we can change. So, one of the things that came up from ours was that our plant wanted to expand it to another department, and we had to talk about the feasibility of that. And then make sure that these changes are getting communicated out appropriately. So here is just a quick example of kind of these little emails that we would send out, just checking back on the week. We would kind of have a report on each kind of higher on class saying, hey, these are the people in the green, they're doing great. These are people in the yellows, these are people who were typically pushed another week. And then people who were in the red. A big thing you see as comments on in this email, it's okay if you can't, you don't need to read all of this, by the way, was that we only had 43% of our employees stay on track with the heat acclimatization program when our goal was 100, right? And then 4 employees were extended because they missed weigh-ins. This is part of that plan, do, check, act. You coming back and saying, what can we adjust? What can we change? We also pointed out an incident we had of 4.7% body weight lost in a single shift by an employee who lost 10.8 pounds. And then we discussed how we had some corrective education and they still greened out within the 2 week period, right? Just kind of reinforcing some of the things that we see continue to pop up. And we had a couple other examples there. So this can be a regular weekly communication that you send out about the program. You don't want to just start it and then you don't check back in with operations, safety, HR, and so on until the summer is over. You can kind of have these regular checkbacks and regular tracking that goes on. And then if you want to be like us, we kind of had put together a bit of a report that went out. And again, you don't have to read all this, but really what I'm showing here is you can see with our injury rate per years on the job, the majority of our injuries were people who had less than 1 year experience in the job. And that's part of why we chose the class, chose the workers that we did as our high risk workers. And then we went and talked about how we had 103 new hires go through the program that summer. And 86% of those workers completed the program in 2 weeks, 9% in 2 to 3 weeks, and 4% taking 3 to 4 weeks, and 1% taking over 4 weeks to complete the program. The most weight lost by a worker during a single 12-hour shift was 16.8 pounds, the largest deficit in 1 week being 23 pounds, and that the average worker lost about 2.4 pounds a shift. And we had a little bit of more communication and education about what the program looks like. Again, just an opportunity to review and really keep that buy-in for what this program is doing and maybe even be able to advocate for gaps that we wanted to close up the next year or changes that we wanted to make. It's often worth it to put that together. And that was our first year in 26 years that they said since they'd had a recordable heat injury in that department. That's the first time going zero, which was when they really started tracking that information. So it was really a resounding success in this case with this group. So hopefully that is valuable and helpful for you guys. Again, in conclusion, you really want your assessment is going to help you identify where you need to put your efforts when it comes to programs like this. And then you really want to prioritize that hydration and acclimatization. That is going to, again, in this case, it brought us down to zero for recordable heat illnesses and injuries. And then you want to PDCA review that. Are we doing what we said we're supposed to be doing? And is it effective? And use that information to continue to inform your program. So thank you all for listening. I know that was a lot, but hey, that's what we're here for, was the deep dive, right? So that's just a little bit of technical information that I hope you guys are able to kind of carry with you and use to either inform your program this year or next year, or whenever you're planning on using this stuff. I can take any questions that anybody has. And I know Mike is going to have the survey information coming up here shortly. Unless nobody has any questions at all. Yes, Craig.
Hey, yeah, can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What do you do with the people that do not meet the weight goals the next morning?
Ooh, that is a great question. So we debated this at our facility. Um, We've had a really hard time getting our operations staff to agree to sit people who came in and had not regained the weight that they were supposed to. So that kind of fell down to us as the injury prevention staff, right? To hydrate, and educate those workers, especially early in the shift. Now, the couple of extremes we did have, we actually did sit those individuals. The guy who lost 23 pounds, because he came in twice and he hadn't gained the weight back overnight he'd actually lost a little bit more. And the third day he came back in, I went to a supervisor and said, hey, this guy's really struggling. And so the supervisor actually agreed for us to sit him. I think the first 4 hours of shift, he didn't work. He ate and hydrated, and then we really monitored him a lot that day. But if you can get a blanket program, I recommend it, but that might be hard to run by ops. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
hmm Anybody else?
Looks like there is a follow-up question in the chat, Susan. What are some things you have done on site to get operation and safety buy-in for heat prevention methods?
Um, Good question. Things we've done on site. I mean, I think the biggest thing is capitalizing on when you have significant heat illness or heat injury, right? Sometimes that can really freak the team out. I don't know if that is a good way to say it, but that can usually get you that buy-in of, hello, did you see what just happened here? This is the solution that we've been recommending. And sometimes it does take patience. I remember when I first started out here in San Antonio, I got here in May and I told them, hey, what's our plan for heat? Are we doing a black flag, red flag? Like, what system you guys use? And they said, this is Texas. It's always a green flag in Texas. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to put some stuff together and send it your way that I recommend. And I sent those recommendations out and they didn't do anything with it. And then the end of May hit and it was 118-degree heat index in the city of San Antonio, and they emailed and said, what should we do? And I forwarded them the email I had sent them 2 weeks prior. And we ended up instituting one of the most robust heat illness prevention programs in construction that I'm aware of to date. Cold water submersion, wet bulb tracking across the job site, shutting down the job site when we hit certain temperatures. We really built a good program, but it took that education and preparedness and then being patient until they were ready to need it. And then we jumped in. What is the biggest hurdle or disadvantage you faced, and how would you recommend someone go about it when they face the same? With regards to kind of this program and instituting an acclimatization program, it is again going to be that we've always done it this way and it's worked. And again, with that, I recommend patience. I recommend creating a sound document, a strong proposal, doing all the legwork and sending that to them so that if something does happen, you also have that backup of, this was my expert opinion that I gave you a long time ago, and I did my due diligence to make these recommendations, but also so that you are ready to hop on that opportunity when it comes up to be able to roll that program out. If you've done the work, then when they come to you, you can capitalize on that buy in. But if they come to you and you're like, oh, give me a couple days to get something together, you might lose that momentum. So I would say just being prepared. So yes. For immersion, there's a question here about submersion techniques, guys. What are we using? So we on all of our job sites, our full site projects that we're on, we have full body ice water submersion available because that is the gold standard, right? And because we recognize that if someone is having a heat stroke, we do need a way to immediately save their life. That was the first thing we ever pushed long before we were able to convince our sites to do wet bulb tracking and so on. So we have full body submersion available. As far as arms, towels, we've done the cold ice vest. We will have some of those available for controls for certain temps or certain styles of work, but that is not our main treatment mechanism. So we don't really have that hygiene concern because if we're using them, they're individuals or specific crews that are choosing to use them for their comfort, and it's not part of our heat protocol system. Good
Hey, Susan,
question.
going a little bit farther in that, I had a question for you.
hmm
When it comes to like body temperature monitoring, like I know you were talking about that throughout
hmm
your presentation, but knowing that the gold standard is rectal temperature. What
Mhm.
barriers have you faced with being able to just do the best we can based on what HR allows us to do versus what
Mhm.
our directives and guidance really have been?
So you are often going to see an utter complete lack of buy-in for that in the industrials in many of the areas in the industrial setting that I've been, unfortunately. It is something that I would like to continue to push for the construction industry, especially because it is the gold standard and heat continues to be something that is only growing and exacerbating in the construction industry. One thing I can recommend if you do have it is if you can and you do not have it available for use on site. Obviously, we know as clinicians, the clinicians on the call, that your barrier for heat stroke should be low when you do not have rectal thermometry available, right? And you can pull that trigger just based off of somebody's presentation. But on top of that, if you have a good relationship with your EMS, seeing if they carry it can be very helpful. Our EMS had a lot of work to do when I first moved here a couple years ago, and they just started as of last year actually cooling before transporting. That took a lot of advocacy, that took a lot of collaboration. And my next goal is going to be for them to carry rectal thermometers. Because again, we're San Antonio, I mean, South and Central Texas. It's something that they can even benefit from.
Not to bogart all the questions, but I didn't see any other hands raised. My question for you is the northern states who have
Hmm.
a really cold spring compared to Texas. And then all of a sudden we get this massive heat wave. So, for example, we went from 60s to 70s to 106 heat index. And
Hmm.
knowing, like in this case, even if let's say that it spiked up to 90, let's say 91, 92 heat index, knowing that that's a really big difference and our bodies haven't really acclimated to that, what kind of
Hmm.
recommendations or programs or awareness do you all do, knowing that you spike that fast and our bodies aren't used to that up north?
Definitely. And I will even say that we even deal with that here in San Antonio. We go from our kind of spring, which is not as cold as you guys, but it's still cool. And end of May is typically where we set the heat index record for the entire year, right? And then it cools off a little in June and gradually goes back up. I would say that is where that buy in on adjusting work really comes in, especially if you're doing outdoor work. Besides the education around hydration and pushing that to workers, even your workers who are in climate controlled areas that don't have a heat hazard, are going to be bothered by extreme temps in the local area, right? So pushing that education, but really for outside work and the work that's happening out there, making adjustments to the work that is happening is going to be your best option because, again, they're not acclimated. They're probably going to be dehydrated. And so things like a slow start, instituting work rest breaks just when you have that spike so that you don't risk anybody's life, is definitely the recommendation we typically make.
This concludes the IETS On Demand Continuing Education Program video. To claim your CU, you must be a member of the Industrial Athletic Trainers Society and complete the From Claim Your CU found in the YouTube description. If you have any interest in learning more about what the Education Committee has to offer, reach out to the email address on your screen. If you would like to volunteer your time to speak on a topic that interests you, please reach out. Thank you and stay safe.